comes from the heart. Elegance isn't a superficial thing. It's the way mankind has found to honor life and work. That's why, when you feel uncomfortable in that position, you mustn't think that it's false or artificial. It's real and true precisely because it's difficult. That position means that both the paper and the brush feel proud of the effort you're making. The paper ceases to be a flat, colorless surface and takes on the depth of the things placed on it. Elegance is the correct posture if the writing is to be perfect. It's the same with life. When all superfluous things have been discarded, we discover simplicity and concentration. The simpler and more sober the posture, the more beautiful it will be, even though at first it may seem uncomfortable. Occasionally, she would talk about her work. She said she was enjoying what she was doing, and that she had just received a job offer from a powerful emir. He had gone to the bank to see the manager, who was a friend of his. Emirs never go to banks to withdraw money. They have staff who can do that for them. And while he was talking to Athena, he mentioned that he was looking for someone to take charge of selling land, and wondered if she would be interested. Who would want to buy land in the middle of the desert or in a far-flung port? I decided to say nothing, and looking back, I'm glad I stayed silent. Only once did she mention the man she loved, although whenever she was there, when tourists arrived, one of the men would always start flirting with her. Normally, Athena simply ignored them. But one day, a man suggested that he knew her boyfriend. She turned pale and immediately shot a glance at her son, who, fortunately, wasn't listening to the conversation. How do you know him? I'm joking, said the man. I just wanted to find out if you were unattached. She didn't say anything, but I understood from this exchange that the man in her life was not the father of her son. One day she arrived earlier than usual. She said that she'd left her job at the bank and started selling real estate and would now have more free time. I explained that I couldn't start her class any earlier because I had various things to do. I can combine two things, movement and stillness, joy and concentration. She went over to the car to fetch her cassette tape player, and from then on, Athena would dance in the desert before the start of our class, while the little boy ran around her laughing. When she sat down to practice calligraphy, her hand was steadier than usual. There are two kinds of letters, I explained. The first is precise, but lacks soul. In this case, although the calligrapher may have mastered the technique, he has focused solely on the craft, which is why it hasn't evolved but become repetitive. He hasn't grown at all. And one day he'll give up the practice of writing because he feels it is mere routine. The second kind is done with great technique, but with soul as well. For that to happen, the intention of the writer must be in harmony with the world. In this case, the saddest verses cease to be clothed in tragedy and are transformed into simple facts encountered along the way. What do you do with your drawings? Asked the boy in perfect Arabic. He might not understand our conversation, but he was eager to share in his mother's work. I sell them. Can I sell my drawings? You should sell your drawings. One day, you'll become rich that way and be able to help your mother. He was pleased by my comment and went back to what he was doing, painting a colorful butterfly. And what shall I do with my texts? Asked Athena. You know the effort it took to sit in the correct position, to quiet your soul, keep your intentions clear, and respect each letter of each word. Meanwhile, keep practicing. After a great deal of practice, We no longer think about all the necessary movements we must make. They become part of our existence. Before reaching that stage, however, you must practice and repeat. And if that's not enough, you must practice and repeat some more. Look at a skilled blacksmith working steel. To the untrained eye, he's merely repeating the same hammer blows. But anyone trained in the art of calligraphy knows that each time the blacksmith lifts the hammer and brings it down, the intensity of the blow is different. The hand repeats the same gesture, but as it approaches the metal, it understands that it must touch it with more or less force. It's the same thing with repetition. It may seem the same, but it's always different. The moment will come when you no longer need to think about what you're doing. You become the letter, the ink, the paper, the word. This moment arrived almost a year later. By then, Athena was already known in Dubai and recommended my tent as a place for her customers to dine. And through them, I learned that her career was going very well. She was selling pieces of desert. One night, the emir in person arrived, preceded by a great retinue. I was terrified. I wasn't prepared for that, but he reassured me and thanked me for what I was doing for his employee. She's an excellent person and attributes her qualities to what she's learning from you. I'm thinking of giving her a share in the company. It might be a good idea to send my other sales staff to learn calligraphy, especially now that Athena is about to take a month's holiday. It wouldn't help, I replied. Calligraphy is just one of the ways which Allah, blessed be His name, places before us. It teaches objectivity and patience, respect and elegance. But we can all learn that. Through dance, said Athena, who was standing nearby. Or through selling land, I added. When they had all left and the little boy had lain down in one corner of the tent, his eyes heavy with sleep, I brought out the calligraphy materials and asked her to write something. In the middle of the word, I took the brush from her hand. It was time to say what had to be said. I suggested that we go for a little walk in the desert. You have learned what you needed to learn, I said. Your calligraphy is getting more and more individual and spontaneous. It's no longer a mere repetition of beauty, but a personal creative gesture. You have understood what all great painters understand. In order to forget the rules, you must know them and respect them. You no longer need the tools that helped you learn. You no longer need paper, ink, or brush, because the path is more important than whatever made you set off along it. Once you told me that the person who taught you to dance used to imagine the music playing in his head, and even so, he was able to repeat the necessary rhythms. He was. If all the words were joined together, they wouldn't make sense. Or at the very least, they'd be extremely hard to decipher. The spaces are crucial. She nodded. And although you have mastered the words, you haven't yet mastered the blank spaces. When you are concentrating, your hand is perfect. But when it jumps from one word to the next, it gets lost. How do you know that? Am I right? Absolutely. Before I focus on the next word, for a fraction of a second, I lose myself. Things I don't want to think about take over. And you know exactly what those things are. Athena knew, but she said nothing until we went back to the tent and she could cradle her sleeping son in her arms. Her eyes were full of tears, although she was trying hard to control herself. The emir said that you were going on holiday. She opened the car door, put the key in the ignition, and started the engine. For a few moments, only the noise of the engine troubled the silence of the desert. I know what you mean, she said at last. When I write, I dance, I'm guided by the hand that created everything. When I look at Viorel sleeping, I know that he knows he's the fruit of my love for his father, even though I haven't seen his father for more than a year. But She fell silent again. Her silence was the blank space between the words. But I don't know the hand that first rocked me in the cradle. The hand that wrote me in the book of the world. I merely nodded. Do you think that matters? Not necessarily. But in your case, until you touch that hand, your, shall we say, calligraphy will not improve. I don't see why I should bother to look for someone who never took the trouble to love me. She closed the car door, smiled, and drove off. Despite her last words, I knew what her next step would be. Samira R. Khalil, Athena's mother. It was as if all her professional success, her ability to earn money, her joy at having found a new love, her contentment when she played with her son, my grandson, had all been relegated to second place. I was quite simply terrified when Shireen told me that she'd decided to go in search of her birth mother. At first, of course, I took consolation in the thought that the adoption center would no longer exist. The paperwork would all have been lost. Any official she encountered would prove implacable. The recent collapse of the Romanian government would make travel impossible, and the womb that bore her would long since have vanished. This, however, provided only a momentary consolation. My daughter was capable of anything, and would overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Up until then, the subject had been taboo in the family. Shireen knew she was adopted because the psychiatrist in Beirut had advised me to tell her as soon as she was old enough to understand. But she had never shown any desire to know where she had come from. Her home had been Beirut, when it was still our home. The adopted son of a friend of mine had committed suicide at the age of 16 when he acquired a biological sister. And so we had never attempted to have more children of our own. And we did everything we could to make her feel that she was the sole reason for our joys and sadnesses, our love and our hopes. And yet it seemed that none of this counted. Dear God, how ungrateful children can be. Knowing my daughter as I did, I realized that there was no point in arguing with her about this. My husband and I didn't sleep for a whole week, and every morning, every evening, we were bombarded with the same question. Whereabouts in Romania was I born? To make matters worse, Viorel kept crying, as if he understood what was going on. I decided to consult a psychiatrist again. I asked why a young woman who had everything in life should always be so dissatisfied. We all wanted to know where we came from, he said. On the philosophical level, that's the fundamental question for all human beings. In your daughter's case, I think it's perfectly reasonable that she should want to go in search of her roots. Wouldn't you be curious to know? No, I wouldn't. On the contrary, I'd think it dangerous to go in search of someone who had denied and rejected me when I was still too helpless to survive on my own. But the psychiatrist insisted. Rather than getting into a confrontation with her, try to help. Perhaps when she sees that it's no longer a problem for you, she'll give up. And far from her friends, must have created a sense of emotional need, which she's now trying to make up for by provoking you like this. She simply wants to be sure that she's loved. It would have been better if Shireen had gone to the psychiatrist herself. Then she would have understood the reasons for her behavior. Show that you're confident and don't see this as a threat. And if in the end she really does go ahead with it, simply give her the information she needs. As I understand it, she's always been a difficult child. Perhaps she'll emerge from this search a stronger person. I asked if the psychiatrist had any children. He didn't, and I knew then that he wasn't the right person to advise me. That night, when we were sitting in front of the TV, Shireen returned to the subject. What are you watching? The news. What for? To find out what's going on in Lebanon, replied my husband. I saw the trap, but it was too late. Shireen immediately pounced on this opening. You see, you're curious to know what's going on in the country where you were born. You're settled in England, you have friends, Dad earns plenty of money, you've got security, and yet you still buy Lebanese newspapers. You channel hop until you find a bit of news to do with Beirut. You imagine the future as if it were the past, not realizing that the war will never end. What I mean is that if you're not in touch with your roots, you feel as if you'd lost touch with the world. Is it so very hard then for you to understand what I'm feeling? You're our daughter. And proud to be. And I'll always be your daughter. Please don't doubt my love or my gratitude for everything you've done for me. All I'm asking is to be given the chance to visit the place where I was born, and perhaps ask my birth mother why she abandoned me, or perhaps, when I look into her eyes, simply say nothing. If I don't at least try and do that, I'll feel like a coward, and I won't ever understand the blank spaces. The blank spaces. I learned calligraphy while I was in Dubai. I dance whenever I can, but music only exists because the pauses exist. And sentences only exist because the blank spaces exist. When I'm doing something, I feel complete. But no one can keep active 24 hours a day. As soon as I stop, I feel there's something lacking. You've often said to me that I'm a naturally restless person. But I didn't choose to be that way. I'd like to sit here quietly, watching television, but I can't. My brain won't stop. Sometimes I think I'm going mad. I need always to be dancing, writing, selling land, taking care of VRL, or reading whatever I find to read. Do you think that's normal? Perhaps it's just your temperament, said my husband. The conversation ended there as it always did, with VRL crying, Shireen retreating into silence, and with me convinced that children never acknowledge what their parents have done for them. However, over breakfast the next day, it was my husband who brought the subject up again. A while ago, while you were in the Middle East, I looked into the possibility of going home to Beirut. I went to the street where we used to live. The house is no longer there, but despite the foreign occupation and the constant incursions, they are slowly rebuilding the country. I felt a sense of euphoria. Perhaps it was the moment to start all over again. And it was precisely that expression, start all over again, that brought me back to reality. The time has passed when I could allow myself that luxury. Nowadays, I just want to go on doing what I'm doing, and I don't need any new adventures. I sought out the people I used to enjoy a drink with after work. Most of them have left, and those who have stayed complain all the time about the constant feeling of insecurity. I walked past some of my old haunts and I felt like a stranger, as if nothing there belonged to me anymore. The worst of it was that my dream of one day returning gradually disappeared when I found myself back in the city where I was born. Even so, I needed to make that visit. The songs of exile are still there in my heart, but I know now that I'll never again live in Lebanon. In a way, the days I spent in Beirut helped me to a better understanding of the place where I live now, and to value each second that I spend in London. What are you trying to tell me, Dad? That you're right. Perhaps it really would be best to understand those blank spaces. We can look after Viorel while you're away." He went to the bedroom and returned with the yellow file containing the adoption papers. He gave them to Shireen, kissed her, and said it was time he went to work. Heron Ryan, journalist. For a whole morning in 1990, all I could see from the sixth-floor window of the hotel was the main government building. A flag had just been placed on the roof, marking the exact spot where the megalomaniacal dictator had fled in a helicopter, only to find death a few hours later at the hands of those he had oppressed for 22 years. In his plan to create a capital that would rival Washington, Ceausescu had ordered all the old houses to be razed to the ground. Indeed, Bucharest had the dubious honor of being described as the city that had suffered the worst destruction outside of a war or a natural disaster. The day I arrived, I attempted to go for a short walk with my interpreter, but in the streets I saw only poverty, bewilderment, and a sense that there was no future, no past, and no present. The people were living in a kind of limbo, with little idea of what was happening in their country or in the rest of the world. When I went back 10 years later and saw the whole country rising up out of the ashes, I realized human beings can overcome any difficulty, and that the Romanian people were a fine example of just that. But on that other grey morning, in the grey foyer of a gloomy hotel, all I was concerned about was whether my interpreter would manage to get a car and enough petrol so that I could carry out some final research for the BBC documentary I was working on. He was taking a very long time, and I was beginning to have my doubts. Would I have to go back to England having failed to achieve my goal? I'd already invested a significant amount of money in contracts with historians, in the script, in filming interviews. But before the BBC would sign the final contract, they insisted on me visiting Dracula's castle to see what state it was in. The trip was costing more than I expected. I tried phoning my girlfriend, but was told I'd have to wait nearly an hour to get a line. My interpreter might arrive at any moment with the car, and there was no time to lose, and so I decided not to risk waiting. I asked around to see if I could buy an English newspaper, but there were none to be had. To take my mind off my anxiety, I started looking, as discreetly as I could, at the people around me drinking tea, possibly oblivious to everything that had happened the year before. Popular uprisings, the cold-blooded murder of civilians in Timisoara, shootouts in the streets between the people and the dreaded Secret Service, as the latter tried desperately to hold on to the power fast slipping from their grasp. I noticed a group of 3 Americans, an interesting-looking woman who was, however, glued to the fashion magazine she was reading, and some men sitting round a table, talking loudly in a language I couldn't identify. I was just about to get up yet again and go over to the entrance to see if my interpreter was anywhere to be seen, when she came in. She must have been a little more than 20 years old. She sat down, ordered some breakfast, and I noticed that she spoke English. None of the other men present appeared to notice her arrival, but the other woman interrupted her reading. Perhaps because of my anxiety, or because of the place which was beginning to depress me, I plucked up my courage and went over to her. "Excuse me, I don't usually do this. I always think breakfast is the most private meal of the day." She smiled, told me her name, and I immediately felt wary. It had been too easy. She might be a prostitute. Her English, however, was perfect, and she was very discreetly dressed. I decided not to ask any questions and began talking at length about myself, noticing as I did so that the woman at the next table had put down her magazine and was listening to our conversation. I'm an independent producer working for the BBC in London, and at the moment I'm trying to find a way to get to Transylvania. I noticed the light in her eyes change. "So that I can finish the documentary I'm making about the myth of the vampire." I waited. This subject always aroused people's curiosity, but she lost interest as soon as I mentioned the reason for my visit. "You'll just have to take the bus," she said, "although I doubt you'll find what you're looking for. If you want to know more about Dracula, read the book. The author never even visited Romania." What about you? Do you know Transylvania?" "I don't know." That was not an answer. Perhaps it was because English, despite her British accent, was not her mother tongue. "But I'm going there too," she went on the bus, of course. Judging by her clothes, she was not an adventuress who sets off around the world visiting exotic places. The idea that she might be a prostitute returned. Perhaps she was trying to get closer to me. "Would you like a lift?" "I've already bought my ticket." I insisted, thinking that her first refusal was just part of the game. She refused again, saying that she needed to make that journey alone. I asked where she was from, and there was a long pause before she replied. "Like I said, from Transylvania." That isn't quite what you said, but if that's so, perhaps you could help me with finding locations for the film, and my unconscious mind was telling me to explore the territory a little more. Because although the idea that she might be a prostitute was still buzzing around in my head, I very, very much wanted her to come with me. She politely refused my offer. The other woman joined in the conversation at this point, as if to protect the younger woman, and I felt then that I was in the way and decided to leave. My interpreter arrived shortly afterward, out of breath, saying that he'd made all the necessary arrangements, but that, as expected, it was going to cost a lot of money. I went up to my room, grabbed my suitcase, which I'd packed earlier, got into the Russian wreck of a car, drove down the long, almost deserted avenues, and realized that I had with me my small camera, my belongings, my anxieties, a couple of bottles of mineral water, some sandwiches, and the image of someone that stubbornly refused to leave my head. In the days that followed, as I was trying to piece together a script on the historical figure of Dracula, and interviewing both locals and intellectuals on the subject of the vampire myth, with, as foreseen, little success, I gradually became aware that I was no longer merely trying to make a documentary for British television. I wanted to meet that arrogant, unfriendly, self-sufficient young woman whom I'd seen in a cafe in a hotel in Bucharest, and who would, at that moment, be somewhere nearby. I knew absolutely nothing about her apart from her name, but like the vampire of the myth, she seemed to be sucking up all my energy. In my world, and in the world of those I lived with, this was absurd, nonsensical, unacceptable. Deirdre O'Neill, known as Edda. I don't know what you came here to do, but whatever it was, you must see it through to the end. She looked at me, startled. Who are you? I started talking about the magazine I was reading, and after a while the man sitting with her decided to get up and leave. Now I could tell her who I was. If you mean what do I do for a living, I qualified as a doctor some years ago, but I don't think that's the answer you want to hear. I paused. Your next step, though, will be to try to find out, through clever questioning, exactly what I'm doing here, in a country that's only just emerging from years of terrible oppression. I'll be straightforward then. What did you come here to do? I could have said, I came for the funeral of my teacher, because I felt he deserved that homage. But it would be imprudent to touch on the subject. She may have shown no interest in vampires, but the word teacher would be sure to attract her attention. Since my oath would not allow me to lie, I replied with a half-truth. I wanted to see where a writer called Mircea Eliade lived. You've probably never heard of him, but Eliade, who spent a great part of his life in France and the USA, was a world authority on myths. The young woman looked at her watch, feigning indifference. I went on. And I'm not talking about vampires. I'm talking about people who, let's say, are following the same path you're following. She was about to take a sip of her coffee, but she stopped. Are you from the government, or are you someone my parents engaged to follow me? It was my turn then to feel uncertain as to whether to continue the conversation. Her response had been unnecessarily aggressive, but I could see her aura, her anxiety. She was very like me when I was her age, full of internal and external wounds that drove me to want to heal people on the physical plane and to help them find their path on the spiritual plane. I wanted to say, your wounds will help you, my dear, then pick up my magazine and leave. If I had done that, Athena's path might have been completely different, and she would still be alive and living with the man she loved. She would have brought up her son and watched him grow, get married and have lots of children. She would be rich, possibly the owner of a company selling real estate. She had all the necessary qualities to find success and happiness. She'd suffered enough to be able to use her scars to her advantage, and it was just a matter of time before she managed to control her anxiety and move on. So what kept me sitting there, trying to keep the conversation going? The answer is very simple. Curiosity. I couldn't understand what that brilliant light was doing there in the cold hotel foyer. I continued. Mircea Eliade wrote books with strange titles. Occultism, Witchcraft and Cultural Fashions, for example, or The Sacred and the Profane. My teacher, I inadvertently let the word slip, but she either wasn't listening or else pretended not to have noticed, loved his work. And something tells me it's a subject you're interested in too. She glanced at her watch again. I'm going to Sibiu, she said. My bus leaves in an hour. I'm looking for my mother, if that's what you want to know. I work as a real estate agent in the Middle East. I have a son of nearly 4. I'm divorced and my parents live in London. My adoptive parents, of course, because I was abandoned as a baby. She was clearly at a very advanced stage of perception and had identified with me, even though she wasn't aware of this yet. Yes, that's what I wanted to know. Did you have to come all this way just to do research into a writer? Aren't there any libraries where you live? The fact is that Eliade only lived in Romania until he graduated from university. So if I really wanted to know more about his work, I should go to Paris, London, or to Chicago where he died. However, what I'm doing isn't research in the normal sense of the word. I wanted to see the ground where he placed his feet. I wanted to feel what inspired him to write about things that affect my life and the lives of people I respect. Did he write about medicine too? I'd better not answer that. I saw that she'd picked up on the word teacher and assumed it must be related to my profession. The young woman got to her feet. I felt she knew what I was talking about. I could see her light shining more intensely. I only achieve this state of perception when I'm close to someone very like myself. Would you mind coming with me to the bus station? She asked. Not at all. My plane didn't leave until later that night, and a whole, dull, endless day stretched out before me. At least I'd have someone to talk to for a while. She went upstairs, returned with her suitcases in her hand and a series of questions in her head. She began her interrogation as soon as we left the hotel. I may never see you again, she said, but I feel that we have something in common. Since this may be the last opportunity we have in this incarnation to talk to each other, would you mind being direct in your answers? I nodded. Based on what you've read in all those books, do you believe that through dance we can enter a trance-like state that helps us to see a light? And that the light tells us nothing, only whether we're happy or sad? A good question. Of course, and that happens not only through dance, but also through anything that allows us to focus our attention and to separate body from spirit, like yoga, or prayer, or Buddhist meditation. Or calligraphy? I hadn't thought of that, but it's possible. At such moments, when the body sets the soul free, the soul either rises up to heaven or descends into hell, depending on the person's state of mind. In both cases, it learns what it needs to learn, to destroy or to heal. But I'm no longer interested in individual paths. In my tradition, I need the help of... Are you listening to me? No. She had stopped in the middle of the street and was staring at a little girl, who appeared to have been abandoned. She went to put her hand in her bag. Don't do that, I said. Look across the street at that woman, the one with cruel eyes. She's put the girl there purely in order to... I don't care. She took out a few coins. I grabbed her hand. Let's buy her something to eat. That would be more useful. I asked the little girl to go with us to a bar and bought her a sandwich. The little girl smiled and thanked me. The eyes of the woman across the street seemed to glitter with hatred, but for the first time, the grey eyes of the young woman walking at my side looked at me with respect. What were you saying? She asked. It doesn't matter. Do you know what happened to you a few moments ago? You went into the same trance that your dancing provokes.
No, you're wrong.
I'm right. Something touched your unconscious mind. Perhaps you saw yourself as you would have been if you hadn't been adopted, begging in the street. At that moment, your brain stopped reacting, your spirit left you, and travelled down to hell to meet the demons from your past. Because of that, you didn't notice the woman across the street. You were in a trance, a disorganized, chaotic trance that was driving you to do something that was good in theory, but in practice pointless. As if you were
in the blank space between the letters, in the moment when a note of music ends and the next has not yet begun.
Exactly. And such a trance can be dangerous. I almost said it's the kind of trance provoked by fear. It paralyzes the person, leaves them unable to react. The body doesn't respond, the soul is no longer there. You were terrified by everything that could have happened to you had your fate not placed your parents in your path. But she had put her suitcases down on the ground and was standing in front of me.
Who are you? Why are you saying all this?
As a doctor, I'm known as Deirdre O'Neill. Pleased to meet you. And what's your name?
Athena. Although, according to my passport, I'm Shireen Khalil.
Who gave you the name Athena?
No one important. But I didn't ask you for your name. I asked you who you are and why you spoke to me. And why I felt the same need to talk to you. Was it just because we were the only two women in that cafe? I don't think so. And you're saying things to me that make sense of my life.
She picked up her bags again, and we continued walking toward the bus station. I have another name too, Edda. But it wasn't chosen by chance. Nor do I believe it was chance that brought us together. Before us was the entrance to the bus station, with various people going in and out. Soldiers in uniform, farmers, pretty women dressed as if they were still living in the 1950s.
If it wasn't chance, what was it?
She had another half an hour before her bus left, and I could have said, it was the mother. Some chosen spirits emit a certain light and are drawn to one another, and you, Shireen or Athena, are one of those spirits, but you need to work very hard to use that energy to your advantage. I could have explained that she was following the classic path of the witch, who, through her individual persona, seeks contact with the upper and lower world, but always ends up destroying her own life. She serves others, gives out energy, but receives nothing in return. I could have explained that although all paths are different, there is always a point when people come together, celebrate together, discuss their difficulties, and prepare themselves for the rebirth of the mother. I could have said that contact with the divine light is the greatest reality a human being can experience. And yet, in my tradition, that contact cannot be made alone, because we've suffered centuries of persecution, and this has taught us many things.
Would you like to have a coffee while I wait for the bus?
No, I did not. I would only end up saying things which might, at that stage, be misinterpreted.
Certain people have been very important in my life,
she went on.
My landlord, for example, or the calligrapher I met in the desert near Dubai. Who knows? You might have things to say to me that I can share with them, and repay them for all they've taught me.
So she had already had teachers in her life. Excellent. All she needed was to continue her training, otherwise she would end up losing all she had achieved. But was I the right person? I asked the mother to inspire me, to tell me what to do. I got no answer, which did not surprise me. She always behaves like that when it's up to me to take responsibility for a decision. I gave Athena my business card and asked her for hers. She gave me an address in Dubai, a country I would have been unable to find on the map. I decided to try making a joke to test her out a little more. Isn't it a bit of a coincidence that 3 English people should meet in a cafe in Bucharest?
Well, from your card, I see that you're Scottish. The man I met apparently works in England, but I don't know anything else about him.
She took a deep breath.
And I'm Romanian.
I gave an excuse and said that I had to rush back to the hotel and pack my bags. Now she knew where to find me. If it was written that we would meet again, we would. The important thing is to allow fate to intervene in our lives and to decide what is best for everyone.